That recording will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, and screenshots will be taken for both social media and documentation purposes. Good morning, everyone. We will start at exactly 10:15 a.m. We would also like to inform you that this session will be recorded. Said recording will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, and screenshots will be taken for both social media and documentation purposes. Thank you. So good morning, everyone. We will start exactly at 10:15 a.m., so around 5 minutes. We would like to inform you that this session will be recorded. Said recording will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, and screenshots will be taken for both social media and documentation purposes. So good morning, everyone. We will start at exactly 10:15 a.m., around 5 minutes. We would also like to inform you that this session will be recorded. Said recording will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, and screenshots will be taken for both social media and documentation purposes. Thank you. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Before we start this workshop, we would like to inform you of our guidelines for this entire session. So, first, this session will be recorded. Said recording will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, and screenshots will be taken for both social media and documentation purposes. Next, be on your best behavior by avoiding profanity or unnecessary conversation in the chat box. And lastly, please make sure your mics are muted and only unmute if you would like to speak during our Q&A segments. With that in mind, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first half of our CodeX workshop for our MCL SHS students. So in this session, we are going to discuss a short introduction to programming using Java. We are going to learn a little bit of fundamentals to kickstart our knowledge in this programming language to prepare you for the next part of this workshop. So before we start our discussion, I would like to know something, just a little bit. So who here is experiencing this programming language Java for the first time? So I want to see your hands. So again, I would like to know who here is experiencing Java for the first time. Okay. All right. So only one. Okay. So next, so I assume everybody here had already tried programming Java. Well, regardless of your experience, we will help you gain or refresh your knowledge of Java by learning some of the fundamentals or the essentials of this language, especially for competitive programming. So, but before anything else, I would like to remind and tell all of you to create a HackerRank account. So, using the link in this slide, because we will be using HackerRank for activities throughout the session, both this part and the next part. So, so again, no, before anything else, I would like to remind all of you to create a HackerRank account using the link in this slide, as we will be using HackerRank throughout this session. Okay, now that's out of the way, let's start. So first, let us know what Java is in the first place. So in a nutshell, Java is described as being a multi-purpose, strongly typed, and an object-oriented programming language. By design, it has few implementation dependencies as possible. With this programming language as well, you can create applications on multiple devices. Its scope is very wide, allowing us to create software for many kinds of purposes. For example, Java is mainly used in developing Android applications even until now. Next, Java is also platform independent because it has its own virtual machine so that it can pretty much run on any platform. Usually, the term being associated with Java is what we call the WORA, or what we call the right ones run everywhere or anywhere. So let us start with the fundamentals that we are going to be tackling in this session using Java. So first, we have the input and output, which tackles the basic data in and out, usually using the console. The data types that Java supports, the conditional statements, looping statements, and then finally the arrays. So with that being said, let's start with the output. To show an output in Java, we first pretty much create this line of code. So system out print ln, then a close and open parenthesis, then semicolon. And then inside the parenthesis, we will want to add what we want to output. So in this case, for example, we want to see, for example, the term CodeX as an output. To do this, we simply add, double quotation marks, and then inside it, add the word codex, like so. And if we run the code, we should now see codex as the output. Pretty much simple as that. So there might be some people asking, what does print ln mean, right? So well, there are actually three kinds of print in Java. So the first one is what we used, called the print line, which means that it displays our desired output and then moves to the next line. So that if we want to pretty much print two outputs, the first output will be on the first line, and then the second output will be on the second line, as you can see right there. The next one is the sprint. So it pretty much does the same thing as sprint line, but it does not move to the next line if we wanted another output. So the first and second output will be on the same line. So as you can see there, after the first codex print, it did not move to the next line. So it's next to each other. And then lastly, we have printf, which provides a little bit of string formatting. We will not be using this too much here today, but here's an example of printf. So the first line shows that all the letters must be on lowercase, and the second line should be on uppercase. So that's pretty much how to use output in Java. Now let's move on to the input. Compared to most languages, Java has different ways to get input from the user. In this discussion, we are going to be tackling one of them, which is the scanner. So the scanner is used for obtaining the input of primitive data types such as int, float, double, string, or etc., which we'll be discussing in depth a little bit later. It is one of the scanner is one of the simplest ways to read input in a Java program. So how can we use scanner to get input from the user? So first, we have to import the Java util scanner package by inputting import java.util.scanner on the first few lines of the code. As a side note, a package in Java is simply a container that groups related types or functions. There are packages for many things, for example, math or probably GUI, such as java.awt, and anything similar to that. In this case, a scanner is part of a specific package called java.util. So essentially, in a nutshell, it just means that we are telling Java to access the functionality of scanner into our code. Now we have to create an object of scanner by adding this code to our main method, or the public static void main string args. So this is the main method. So we're going to be putting a scanner, then our variable input equals new scanner system.in. To understand this line of code, we need to pretty much understand the simplest basic structure of a Java program. So in simplest terms, we have the variable declaration. Essentially, that means that we are declaring that this variable is identified as a specific data type or a class. So for example, scanner input means that we are declaring the variable input as a scanner. In this same vein, for example, another scenario, n, the variable n, is declared as an int variable with a value of 1. And of course, each line of code should end with a semicolon. On the other hand, most variables are actually user-defined. So that means that in this case, input is a variable here, can be anything. So it can be like this, scanner CodeX. With this in mind, now we create as well as now we created a scanner object. We can now simply ask for an input. So how can we ask for input? So first we need to declare a variable like in our previous slide. So let's do this. So, double and then number, wherein the variable number is identified containing a value with a double data type. Now we will call our scanner by adding the variable that we declared containing the scanner object, which is input. And then finally, we have to help the scanner identify what input type should the scanner accept. So to do this, we have to enter the specific input type based on our variable's data type. So to help identify this, here's a simple table of all possible input types that we can use. So next accepts a variable or a character from the user. Next line accepts a string from the user. Next int accepts an integer from the user. Next float accepts a decimal number from the user, as well as next double. Then boolean accepts a boolean value from the user, which is true or false. So in this case, since our variable number is under the double data type, you can see we shall be using next double as the input type, and then of course close the line with a semicolon. With this line, our program should now ask for an input that must be of double data type. So let's combine the two concepts, input and output, and make a simple program. So the program is to get two decimal numbers and then display the sum of two numbers. So first, let us import the scanner package into our program like we said before. And then after importing the scanner object, the scanner package, let us now add our scanner object. So let us use the variable, our variable, let us call our variable int for our scanner. So scanner imp equals new scanner system.in. Before we add our input, though, we must let the user know that we are asking for an input and also tell the user what to input. In this case, we want the user to input their first decimal number. So we shall tell them to input the first decimal number that they want by adding a print to prompt them to tell the user to input their first decimal number, like so. After that prompt, we can finally add our variable with the scanner. And since we want a decimal number, we want the variable to be of double data type. So we shall name this variable num1. And of course, we want the scanner to know that it should accept an input that classifies as a double data type right here. And after that, let's do the same thing, but for our second decimal number. So let's call this input num2. Now that our program has two inputs that we needed, we simply have to add them. To do that, we need to declare another variable that contains the sum of the two numbers. We shall call the variable sum and then identify the value of sum as a double data type as well. And the value of sum, of course, must be the sum of num1 and num2, like so. Lastly, let's add another print to display the final answer. We can do that by calling the variable inside the systemoutPrintln function, like so. But we will also add a message as well that this is the sum by adding this to the code. This essentially would just mean that the output will be displayed, will be the sum and then the number. And then with that, we have satisfied the conditions of the program. And if we run it, we have, of course, num1 as 1.1, and then num2 as 0.2 with the appropriate prompts, and then the sum should be 1.3. Also, you have noticed as well that we have used the word double as a term used to tell that the variable will be a decimal. And what we have talked about, the different input types that the scanner can receive based on their data type. So we've saying this data type and all that, but what exactly is a data type and what are the types of data types? So a data type in programming is essentially a classification that specifies which type of value a variable has, and what type of mathematical, relational, or logical operators, which we'll be talking about later, can be applied to it without causing an error to when we run the code. So what are those classifications? In Java specifically, we have around 8 data types. So we have the Boolean, char, byte, short, int, long, float, and double. But in this session, let's just use only 5. So we have the int, double, char, string, and then the Boolean. So int are used for whole numbers such as 1, 2, and 3. Double and float are both floating, or what we call the decimal numbers, such as 1.1, 0.25, and so on. The difference, though, of double and float is that double is a double, with the name double is a double precision floating point, while float is a single precision floating point. That means double is a little bit more precise and also in turn more widely used in this case. But there are also uses to use float. Char is used for single characters like lowercase a, uppercase a, lowercase or uppercase b, and so on. Char, every variable value with the char data type should be opened and closed using a single quotation mark. String, on the other hand, is used for character strings or anything, pretty much anything that contains more than one character, such as a word or a sentence, so on. So, uh, in contrast to char, strings should be opened and closed using a double quotation mark. And then lastly, Boolean is used for true or false values. So Boolean variable should only contain true or false. Boolean is mostly used for conditionals, which we'll be tackling later. So now that that's out of the way, and as well as now that we've learned about input and output, and as well as the data types that Java supports, um, let us have our first activity. So, John Matt, take it away.
Hello, hello. Rinig ba? Rinig.
Yes, we can hear you.
Alright, alright. Hello, my name is John Matthew, and I will be the one facilitating you throughout the code jam activities. Give me a second while I change my screen. All right, so we have two activities for the activity one, input and output discussion. Um, in HackerRank, we will test our skills and we will try to apply what we've learned throughout what we've learned in activity one. So all you need to do for these two activities is to read the description and solve the problems. And you have 5 minutes to solve these two problems. And your timer starts now. Okay, guys, you only have 30 seconds left. Okay, guys, time's up. I hope you all solved the problems in GoJam, I mean in HackerRank. And now I will proceed to discuss the solutions for the problems. Okay, for Java Activity 1A, the problem is that you need to only, okay, for Activity 1, all we need to do in this problem is to concatenate is awesome after the input value and display it. The answer is simple. To begin with, we must get user input by importing Java util over here at the top of the class. Then after that, we need to create a new instance of the scanner here at line 7. After creating a new instance of the scanner, we need to execute the line method to get the user input. Then after that, after receiving the user's input, we'll concatenate is awesome after the value and print it to the console. So here is the example of the working code or the working solution. So if we run the code, you will see that it concatenates is awesome after your input. So that's all for the solution of activity 1A. For the next one is Java activity 1B. All we have to do in this problem is square the integer input and display it. We all know that the square of an integer is derived by multiplying the integer by itself. To acquire the integer input, we first construct an instance of the scanner. So over here, I created a new instance of the scanner. So before doing that, it is important that we import java.util since the scanner class is in java.util. After that, we run the next int method since we need an integer input here. So we call the function called next integer, nextInt. Then after that, we get the integer input, we multiply it by itself and display the result to the console. So if we run the code here, the result should be the square of the input, as you can see here. And that's all for now for the activity 1. And the next part of the discussion will be handled by EJ. Take it away, EJ.
Okay, so thank you, John Matt, for the activity. So now let us move on to the next part, which is the conditionals. So the conditionals are used in programming when we want to tell the program to make a decision based on a certain criteria. So, for example, how would a program know if a specific value stored in a variable is an even or an odd number, and so on. So, conditional statements used in Java are pretty much different from other languages like C or Python if you have experienced them. But I think it's good for us to have a short review if that's the case and know how it's done in Java. So let's try the example that I mentioned. How would the program know if a specific value stored on a variable is an even or an odd number? So first, we want to know what conditional statement is appropriate for this example. Since the number of conditions that we want to put out is only around 2, which is odd or even, then we can use if, or better, the if-else statement for this example. So let's start with the if statement. So the if statement executes the code inside of the curly brackets if the condition put out is true. So this is the syntax of the if statement. So if and then the condition. If it's true, it will execute. At the same time, if the condition is false, on the other hand, then it will move to the next line, which is after the curly brackets. So now you're asking, how can we make a condition? So, well, first we have to understand operators before we do that. In computer science terms, an operator is a character or characters that determine the action that is performed to be performed or considered. We have already done the first type of operator on our input/output part, wherein we added two values together and so on. So those are actually called arithmetic operators. Already stated in its name, arithmetic operators allow arithmetic or calculations to be performed on values. So in Java, we have around 5 main arithmetic operators. So we have our addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, then modulo. So the main four, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, um, are pretty much straightforward. But modulo might be new to some of you. So essentially, modulo will divide the values. However, instead of the results itself, the modulo actually outputs the remainder instead. So for example, if 7 is divided by 4, then the remainder of the result is 3. And so the output is 3. We also have the increment and decrement, wherein we want to add or subtract the value of a variable by 1. We will actually be tackling this a little bit in our next part. So in the case of our example, in the other hand, modulo is actually perfect for a program. As we know, if a number is divisible by 2 and has a remainder of 0, then the number is even. Now, now that we have that knowledge, we can create a condition. So, for example, we want to know if the number 96 is even. So, we simply add our if statement, of course, and then add the condition, which is if 96 modulo 2 equals 0. In other words, is the remainder 0 if we divide 96 by 2. So let us add a statement that confirms that the number is even by putting an output or a print inside the if statement. But hold on, if we run it, it should be an error. That's because on the language, this statement 96 modulo 2 equals 0 in our condition actually means we are declaring that 0 is the value of 96 modulo 2. which is wrong. We want to ask if 96 modulo 2 is equals to 0. We want an output that is either true or false. So how can we correct this? So to do that, we have to understand another type of operator called the relational operator. So relational operators, in a nutshell, enable comparisons to be made. They are specifically used for conditions in our case, like in our case right now. There are 6 that we need to take note of, especially their symbols. We have our equals, equals equals, if two compared values are equal. We have not equals, exclamation point and then equals, if two compared values are not equal. We have less than, if specifically, the first value is less than the second value. We have more than, if, or greater than, if specifically the first value is more than the second value. Take note that the symbols used on less than and more than have no equal sign next to them, as if both of them are equal at any capacity, they will output as false. However, if the value you want is less than or equal to, or maybe more than or equal to, then we simply add an equal sign next to them, like so. Please take note of the differences, as they can give some confusion once you start solving more complex problems. Now that we know what types of relational operators are, we can now fix our error. So by simply changing the assignment operator equals to a relational operator of equals, which is equals equals, our program should now work. Since our number 96 is an even number, then it should output what is inside the code block. So which is this number is an even number. Now, what if it's false? What if the number instead is 97? What will be the output? As you can see, the output should be blank since the condition is false. And since it's false, it will ignore the code inside the if statement. So for example, if we put another output like so, it should output this number is an odd number. Now, what if I put the number back to 96? What would happen? As you can see, the output now displays both of them. Why is that? It is because the statement code inside of the if statement is simply ignored by the program because it is false. Therefore, the line will not reflect in the final output. But if the condition is true, it is not ignored and in turn will execute the code. But regardless if it's true or false, the second print statement, this number is an odd number, will still be executed. So this is where the else comes into play in our if statement. So the code under the else statement will execute if the if statement above the else statement is false, which means if the if the if statement is true, then the else statement will be ignored. So we do this by simply adding an else statement after our if statement, like so. And with that, if now that we added that else, if we run the code, it should only show the one in the if statement. And in the same vein, if we put the if 96 modulo 2 again, it should be the one in the if statement. So now let us try another scenario. What if we want to know if the number is within a specific range? Like for example, group 1 should consist of numbers 1 to 10, group 2, 11 to 20, group 3, 21 and above. So how can we do that? So since there are more than two operators, two conditions that we need to check, specifically around three, which is three groups, group 1, group 2, group 3, we must use another type of condition statement called the if-else-if statement. So else if essentially means that if statement 1 is false, then is statement 2 true? If so, execute the code in statement 2. If it's still false, then is statement 3 true? So on and so forth until we reach the final else condition. So let's assign a number. So let's say int number is equal to 13. Let's start the first condition. If number is less than or equal to 10, then the number is under group 1. Now that we done that, we can use an if else if for the second range, which is group 2. The syntax is the same as the if statement. The only difference that is that we have to put the word else before if, and that's pretty much it. So as you can see here, in this specific problem, we add else if and then the condition. If the number is less than or equals to 20, then it means the number is under group 2. And then finally, we close the conditions by adding an else statement wherein anything outside that range will be group 3. And if we run the program, it should output that the number 13, which we assigned before, is under group 2. And if we change the value of number on our assignment, something like 2, it should say group 1. On the other hand, if we put a number like 68, it should output group 3. And that's pretty much else if. The other hand, we can also add another condition statement inside a condition statement, however we like. That's what we call nested if. So for example, we wanted to output G1A if the number is in the range of 1 to 10 and is an even number, or output G1B if the number is in the range of 1 to 10 and then it's an odd number, so on and so forth. Notice at the end though, I added another thing to the if statement under else, which is this. If number modulo 2 is equals to 0, then vertical bars, number is more than or equal to 200. The vertical bar is actually what under another type of operator called the logical operators. So logical operators are actually used to combine relational operators. There are three kinds of logical operators. So we got our logical end, which outputs true if all conditions are true. Otherwise, it will be false. Logical OR, which outputs true if one of the conditions are true, regardless of where it is. And then logical NOT, which outputs the opposite truth value. In this case, I use logical OR to tell that if the number is even or the number is more than or equal to 200, regardless if it's even or odd. And And then the number is under G3A. Now let's move on to the last conditional statement that we will be tackling today, and that is the switch statement. The switch statement allows us to test the equality of a value of a specific expression or a variable. So if the comparisons we are going to be making are more specifically equal to a certain value, then it might be easier and actually more efficient to use switch statements instead of if else. So this is the syntax of the switch statement. So the expression in the parentheses right here will usually be the variable that the value is stored. And then the switch statement will check if the value of the variable is equivalent to one of the cases. So for example, the value of expression is value 1, which is the first one. And then if it's true, then the statement under case value 1 will be executed. And if if expression is equals to the value 2, then the statements under case value 2 will be executed, and so on. Notice that we have been using break in each case. This is because the break statement is used to terminate the switch case statement. If break is not used, all the statements after the matching case are also executed, as the program will still think that the statements under the other cases after the matching case are still under the matching case. So for example, if the value of expression is value 1, the statements under case value 1 will be executed, but we didn't put a break. What will happen is all the statements in case value 2, 3, and so on and so forth will still be executed because we didn't add a break. So please do not forget to put a break after every case. Now, what if all the cases do not match the actual value? So what if it's outside of the range? Then the default block will be executed instead. The default block is pretty much equivalent to the else statement. So let's do an example scenario. So an example scenario that is perfect for the switch statement is something like, for example, you want to convert a date like 4/12/2022 to a date like April 12, 2022. Pretty much their format. So let's try doing that. So since most of the things presented here are already discussed in depth, I will briefly skim over the stuff that we have already learned. So so that the discussion will be a little bit more shorter and more focused on the switch. So with that in mind, let us make the user input their chosen month, day, and year using an input-output. So let's add the scanner. Now let's ask the user to input the month, day, and then the year. And of course, we will let's put the scanner as well. Now that the values that we needed, now that we have the values that we needed, let us now figure out how can we convert something like the month 1 into the word January, 4 to April, so on and so forth. It turns out that the switch statement can help us do that. So on our switch statement, let us use month as the expression so that the switch statement can check what value is month. So let us start with case 1. So since if month is equals to 1, then it should output January. So we can simply add January, and then so it'll be easier, plus the other details of the date. as the output or the print. And after that, we can simply break. Now that we know this, let's just pretty much duplicate this and do this, the same thing, but we will do it based on the equivalent months. So with that being said, the whole switch statement should look something like this. But we're not yet done. So let's add a default statement in case the user add an invalid month. So what if the user added 13 or something like that, or probably 0? So let's add a default and then add the message that says that the month is invalid or something similar to that. And then we can break again. Now, if we run the program, it should do what we are asking for, like so. So we entered our month, which is 4, day is 12, and then 2022 is here. And then it should output the actual date with the proper format. And that's it for the conditionals in Java. Like in our first part, we shall now try solving a problem on our own using what we have learned about conditions to test what we have learned. With that being said, let's start with the second activity. Let us let us now go back to John Matt to facilitate this activity.
Hello guys, I hope that you've learned a lot for the topic for the topic about conditional. So for this activity, you only have one problem. So for this problem, all you need to do is you need to print fizz if the integer is divisible by 3. Then print buzz if the integer is divisible by 5. Then print fizz buzz if the integer is both divisible by 3 and by 5. And print none otherwise. So I hope you guys are ready for this activity and you will only have 10 minutes to solve this problem. So with that said, I guess the timer will start now. Hello guys, you only have 30 seconds left. Five seconds left. Three, two, one, and time's up. So I hope you guys solved the activity, and I guess I will be the one discussing the solution for this activity. Okay. So let me repeat the problem. So in this case, all we need to do is display fizz if the integer is divisible by 3, buzz if it is divisible by 5, and fizz buzz if it is divisible by if it is both divisible by 3 and 5, and none otherwise. So first, we must create a new instance of the scanner. And before you create a new instance of the scanner, don't forget to add import java.util to use the scanner class. Okay. Then after that, since we need integer input for this activity, we will be using next int to get the input as an integer. Then after that, um, we need to make 4 if statement blocks. The first line of the condition should be a check to see whether if the input is divisible by 3 and 5. So when it comes to creating the conditional statements in this problem, it is important to know which order. Because for example, if we put this condition first, I guess the result will be fizz, since it will skip this this conditional statement check, since there are conditions that conflicts to one another, since you can already see that the second condition and the first condition have the same conditions, as you can see. All right, so the first condition checks whether the value is divisible by 3 and divisible by 5. If so, it will print fizzbuzz. The second condition will check if the value is divisible by 3. If it is divisible by 3, it will print fizz. Then if the value is divisible by 5, it will print buzz. Then otherwise, it will only print none. So I guess that's all for the explanation for the solution of activity 2. The next part will be handled by EJ. So back to you, EJ.
Okay, thank you again, John Matt, for facilitating the second activity. So let's move on to loops. So in computer programming, a loop is a sequence of instructions that is continually repeated until a certain condition has reached. So there are two loops in Java. So that is the for loop and the while loop. So let's start with the for loop. So let's consider this scenario. Let uh let us create a program where we want to add the sum of numbers from 0 to x, where x is whatever the user inputs. So for example, if the user inputs 5, then it would be 0 plus 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5, which is equals to 15. So how can we do this? Well, through for loops. So a for loop repeats the process until it reaches to the point that the condition evaluates to false. So we can make that happen by making expressions that state the initial value, the condition, and the increment or decrement. This is the syntax of it in Java. I will explain these three fields one by one. So first, the initial expression. So the initial expression starts the loop counter by declaring a variable with an initial integer value. So in our scenario's case, we want the initial value to be 0, as we want 0 to be the first number on the equation. So we can do that by declaring a variable. In this case, I is equals to 0. Next is the condition expression. If the condition expression is true, then the statements within the for loop will be executed. However, once the condition returned a value of false, then the for loop stops. So in this case, we want to tell the program that if the value of I is less than or equal to the value that the user inputs. So let us call that user input max value. So we will put it like this, the condition. Lastly, we have the increment or the decrement expression. If you guys remembered on the first part, we talked a little bit about operators, and two of those are the increment and then the decrement. As we said before, the increment and decrement are used when we add or subtract the value of a variable by 1. So what use can the increment or decrement do for in our for loop? As you can see, when the program executes the line of code inside the for loop, as soon as the program reaches at the end of that code block, um, so as you can see, as soon as the program reaches the end of that code block, it will keep looping until the condition returns false. And to do that is to add a increment or a decrement. So we can add or subtract values by 1 to essentially count how many loops it already has been. So if we want to add by 1, we will simply use plus plus. Then if we want to subtract by 1, we will use minus minus. In this scenario, we will use the increment. So while the increment is being run before the statement ends, it will add, in this case, I by 1 through I plus plus, the increment, and then it will keep adding that counter at the end of that loop until it reaches to the point that I is already more than max value. And since I is already more than max value, it will stop the for loop. And essentially, that is the syntax of the for loop. We can actually also access the variable I that we put in the for loop and access its value in our for loop in the statements inside the for loop. So since we want to keep adding the numbers from 0, then 1, then 2, and so on, we can actually use that I as the value to be added, like this. We use a variable sum to store the value of sum, but we used a different way to do it, which is sum plus equals to I. This is actually similar to doing sum equals to sum plus I, but in in our case, it's a bit cleaner and actually a little bit easier to just do this instead, especially in a looping statement. So now that is the entire loop for the scenario actually. So if we apply to a proper code, it should look something like this. So if we try to run it and then the user inputs 5 as the max value, then the sum should be 15, which is of course 0 plus 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 then plus 5. Now let's do a follow-up scenario in that light. What if we want the program to add whatever number we want, and then the length of how much numbers we would like to add can be increased dynamically until we tell the program to stop asking for more numbers to be added. So so with that in mind, how can we exactly put numbers and ask more until we tell the program that we are done adding more numbers? We can actually do that by using while loop. So there are two kinds of while loop actually. We have the while loop, of course, and then the do while loop. While loop is actually very similar to how for loop works, but only the difference is that in while loops, the condition is not exactly dependent on the increment or the decrement of a counter. Instead, in a while loop, the condition can be pretty much be anything. We can do the same thing as for loop, like put a decrement and increment, but we can add our own counter outside the while loop and then add a code that increments or decrements the counter. Or we can also use boolean as a condition, like for example, while confirmation is false, then keep looping that statement, so on and so forth. So the syntax or how can while loop be done is exactly like this. So while and then the condition, and if it's true, it will execute the statement. If it's still true, then it will still execute. And if it's false, it will stop. Now, the do while loop. So the do while loop is actually a variant of the while loop, but unlike while, do while will execute the code block once first before checking if the condition is true. Then it will repeat the loop as long as the condition is true. And if we look at the syntax, we put our statements inside of do. And then we put the while condition after that do code block. So what really is the difference between the two? Why should we use one over the other? Well, to kind of answer that, let us compare two very similar cases. However, one uses while and then another uses the do while. So let's start with while, case 1. As you can see, we initialize the variable I with the value of 1. And then the while loop is executed with a condition that if I is not equals to 1, then output code X. And then regardless of the result, output Java. But since the I is equal to 1, the conditions have returned false. Therefore, the code will not execute in the while loop, and then the output will only be Java. But if we use do while, which is case 2, CodeX is actually still outputted even if the conditions are false. That is because the normal while loop checks the condition first before executing the code block, in contrast to do while, where the condition is being checked after the statement is finished. So please do keep in mind the difference of these two, as it will be very helpful food for thought when we start creating solutions for specific problems, especially in our case for competitive programming. With that in mind, let's go back to our scenario. We want the program to add whatever number we want, and the length of how much numbers we would like to add can be increased dynamically until we tell the program to stop asking for more numbers to be added. We can actually achieve this by adding a while loop, especially a do while. So, how can we do this? So, we want the program to keep looping the specific code block as we input something, aside from a specific input that would terminate the loop. So, we want a specific uh, input for the loop to stop, essentially. So, in this case, we want a number, like for example 0, to be the indicator that the loop must stop, or the program should stop asking for more numbers. So for example, um, if the user inputs 1, it will ask another number. If we input 10, it will ask another number, but we input 0. It will no longer ask for an input and start the next line of code. So to do this, um, so let's do the usual scanner that asks for a number input. Now let's add a do while input, and of course transfer the scanner code inside the block of do, since we want that to be repeated. Now let's add a condition. Since we want that if the user inputs 0, then we have to stop the loop. We can do this by inputting while, then the condition num is not equals to 0, meaning as long as the num inputted is not 0, and then num is not 0 at the end of do, the value of num is not 0 at the end of do, the code in do will repeat. And if we run our code, it should stop looping when we input 0, or the program should stop. And that's while loop, pretty much, the last kind of loop in Java. So how can we add those values together in a solution, since we we discuss this in a with a scenario in mind? So well, first we have to store the values that the user inputted, and then corroborate those numbers together, and then do the calculation. So how can we store those values together? And so that moves on to our last part of this discussion, that is the arrays. So arrays, in short terms, are used to store multiple values in a single variable, instead of declaring separate variables for each value. So rather than doing something like this, which is num1 equals 1, num2 equals 10, num3 equals 15, we can just instead declare one variable, which is num, and then that variable contains the values 1, 10, and 15. So how can we do that exactly in Java? So first, we have to declare that the variable is an array by simply adding square brackets next to the variable's data type. So for example, in square bracket num, string square bracket names, double square brackets heights of students, so on and so forth. And then we would like to also assign the contents of the array by either declaring the value itself through curly brackets like this, int square brackets num equals curly brackets 1, 10, 15, or assigning quote unquote vacant or available elements of the array by adding new, then the variable, then the size of the array that you want. So for example, int square brackets num equals, new int 5, where 5 means that the array can store values, can store 5 values. So 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And since we've now declared that the variable is an array, we can now add and access each value that is stored in the array. So how can we store values in an array? We would simply assign the desired value to a specific element of the array. To kind of simply understand this in an easier way, imagine a cinema with 5 vacant seats. A moviegoer enters the cinema and seats at the first seat. Then a moviegoer enters and seats at the second seat. And then another moviegoer enters, but he reserves at the fifth seat. So he seats at the fifth seat, so on and so forth. In programming, the idea is essentially the same, but imagine the cinema is the variable num, and then the moviegoers are the values. In Java, we can achieve this by assigning a specific element of the array the value that we need. So 1 is in the first element of the array, and programmatically, it can be translated as num square brackets 0, wherein 0 is the first element of the array equals 1. And then num1 is equals to 10, and so on. Now that we pretty much visualize and in turn understand the basics of assigning a value to an array, leading to adding or replacing values, let's go back to our code before. So first, we want to make num into an array. So we can do this by simply adding a square bracket next to int. Next, we need to assign the initial values. And since the contents of the array is up to the user's input, we just need to declare the array size. Now we mentioned that we want the size of the numbers to be dynamic. However, arrays themselves can't simply do that. There's actually a way to do them like that, but it is outside of our the basics of the arrays and our discussion. So we need to do a compromise instead, which we can do. So we should set the size of the array to something safe, like 50 or maybe 100, but not too much. In this case, let us use 50. So int num is equals to new int 50. Now we have to assign each of the numbers that we've inputted to an element. How can we assign them in the proper order then? So we can actually use increments to correctly assign the value to the current element of the array, so that once the first element is occupied, so the first value is occupied, then the counter increments, so it adds by 1, so that the access element on the next input is the second one, so it doesn't replace the first one. So let us assign a counter. So int count equals 0 on the top right here. So now let's call the element by turning num into num open close brackets count, where count is the current element. Then below that, we should add an increment. So count plus plus, Also, I also added something on our while. We actually added a count equals 1 inside num because 1, um, if we just leave it as it is, it will do an error because num is now an array. So it is now asking for a specific element of the array. Then 2, we subtracted 1 to the count because if we did not do that, it will check the value of num that will be used on the next loop, not the value of num that we used on the current loop because we added an increment. And remember, do executes the code first before the condition. So now let us access the values inside the array. And it's actually very straightforward. We simply just call the element. So let's add the print line at the end and then tell the program to print the first two elements, num0 and num1, to kind of test this. And if we take a look at the output, it displays the current values. So input number 1, 10, 15, then 0. And of course, the first number is 0 as 1, and then the second input is 10, and so it appropriately shows that. Now, based on what we've learned, let's add the numbers. So we would simply use the for loops counter to iterate between the elements of the array, like what we see here on our screen. So num.length simply checks the number of the array size, which is 50. This is actually very helpful if in case, for example, we want to change the array size to 100 or any number, we don't have to pretty much manually set the for loop to 100 themselves if we want to change it. So in the for loop, it will check the value and add num0 first and then num1, so on and so forth because of the loop. With that in mind, this is what the whole code looks like, which is just a combination of what we've learned. And this is the output if we want to add 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9 together. And with that, that's pretty much loops and arrays. To recap everything, we've learned how to accept and display user input in Java using system out for output and scanner for input. We also tackled the data types that Java uses, particularly the data types such as int, double, char, string, and boolean, as well as the types of operators that we will encounter when coding. We have learned the two conditional statements that are used in Java, namely if, else, else if, and switch, as well as the nested if. And finally, we get to know more about loops through for loops and while loop. Then lastly, the assignment of values and declaration of variables that we want to be in an array. And that's pretty much what we've learned in this part. To culminate everything that we have learned here in our recap, of course, and our discussions, we have one last hurrah or one last activity for you all. This activity will test everything I mentioned in this recap. It will now test all of you uh, on what we have learned for today. So with that, I would like to call on for the last time John Matt to preside this last activity.
Okay, hello guys. I hope that you've learned a lot today, and this is going to be the last activity for this session. So we only have one problem for this activity for loops and arrays, and for the rest of the parts that you learned in introduction. So in this problem, that's the you need what you need to do is that we must count the occurrences of a character that is entered by the user in the word that is also entered by the user. So in short, the user will have two inputs. The first one will be a character that the user wants to find and the word, and the second input is going to be the word, the sample word. So for example, in the word programming, you want to find C. So as you can see, it is obviously that the word programming doesn't have the character C, so the output will be 0. So that's all for my explanation for this problem. And you only have 50 minutes to solve this problem. And your timer starts now.
We also have we also have sent a syntax guide that pretty much summarizes everything that we have learned on the text box. So please use them as well. Take advantage of it. Thank you.
Okay, guys, 30 seconds left. Five seconds left. Three, two, one, and time's up. I hope you guys solved the final problem. And now I'm going to proceed to HackerRank to explain the solution. Okay, so I guess I should repeat what the problem is. So in this problem, we must count the occurrences of a certain character that is entered by the user that is also entered by the user. So first thing we need to do is that we need to create a new instance of the scanner. So before we create a new instance of the scanner, take note that it is important that we import java.util first before we use the scanner. So we use the scanner so that we can use the function next line so that we can get the user input. So the next part of the code is that we get the user input. We get the user input, and we also on the first part of the user input, we only need to get the first character of the input. So to do that, we need to use char at 0. So 0 means the first index of the character. So imagine that string is an array of characters. Well, to get the first character, we need to use 0 to get the first character in the string, since we all know that array starts with 0. So the next part of the code, we'll get the word that we will be using to find the count of a specific character in the word. Following the acquisition of the user input, we establish a variable that will be used to count the occurrences of the entered character in the inputted string. So this is the variable I that is declared for counting the occurrences of the character. Then for the next part of the code is where the loop is declared. So this is a for loop, and it is used to walk through all the characters in the word. So while it walks through, while it iterates through all the characters in the string, it has an if statement if the current character in the current iteration is equivalent to the character that the user wants to find. So if the condition is true, it will increment the variable character. Then after walking through all the characters in the word, it will print the number of occurrences of the character. So that's all for the explanation of the activity 3. The next part of the last part of the session will be handled by EJ. Back to you, EJ.
All right. So thank you for the last time, John Matt, for facilitating the last activity. So now that everybody has through the activities has experience in coding Java, and to some extent through the HackerRank activities, programming challenges, now that you have the tools and to some extent the skills to take the programming to the next level, you are pretty much ready to experience a more critical thinking side of programming, which is what we like to call competitive programming. Even though we have tackled Java in a more fundamental way in this part of the session, Java is capable of more than that. As we said in our introduction, Java is widely used in many systems today. So I would like to extend this opportunity uh, for all of you through this part of the session to explore more about Java programming on your own or through external means such as YouTube videos or uh, lessons, school, or probably through something like Coursera. So before we end this part of this workshop, on behalf of the R&D committee, I would like to thank the executive committee in MCL ACM for the opportunity to share our knowledge outside of our organization and college. I would personally like to thank the R&D committee as well for the assistance in preparation for this part of the session. Again, thank you, John Matt, for facilitating our activities. Thank you, Job, for assisting with the preparation of this part. Um, James, Arthur, Jopet, and Carlo, thank you as well. Of course, our Vicer, Sir Ian, thank you as well. And lastly, to all of you here for listening, thank you very much. So with that, I hope you've learned a lot in this part of the session, and I hope this will kickstart you for the more complex or competitive side of programming. Before I finish off this discussion, I and the rest of the R&D committee will entertain your questions and inquiries about this topic in the chat box after this part of the session. In fact, we do encourage you to do so. So don't hesitate to ask questions in the text box and we will answer them accordingly. Thank you very much for giving me the time to teach you all, but don't leave just yet. After this part of the session at around 1 p.m., we will now commence the next part of our workshop, which is the main event in this CodeX workshop. Again, thank you very much and see you all later.